The snow was still falling when they abandoned her, barefoot, blood staining the ground beneath her, her newborn daughter crying against her chest. Her family stood at a distance, faces cold as stone, their judgment sharper than the winter air. She had given them shame, they said she had given birth to a girl. They turned their backs one by one, leaving her to the wolves and the cold night. Her fingers trembling and frozen tightened around the infant. She would not beg, she would not cry, and that's when he appeared from the shadows of the pine trees, a figure on horseback, a Cheyenne warrior, silent and fierce, his eyes meeting hers in a way no one else has ever had. Without a word he dismounted, wrapped her in his cloak and lifted her in the baby, as if carrying the last light left in a dying world. She had been left to bleed and vanish, but fate had other plans. Subscribe now, because tomorrow's story will haunt you even deeper. You'll need it, but before that let me take you to the day it all began. The wind in Dead Hollow carried more than dust, it carried stories, stories that stuck to skin like smoke and stained a person deeper than dirt ever could. It clung to her, especially Mira, the girl with the quiet eyes, the crooked ankle, and no place to belong. The town was a single road framed by warped buildings and half-buried hopes. Children played in the dirt with sticks and stones, their laughter sharp as the rusted bell outside the chapel. Women stood at fences and porches, hanging out linens and letting their words hang longer than the clothes. She don't talk much, someone would say. Don't need to. Her mother was strange too. She limped like a curse as, dragging behind her, Mira walked past them all, her eyes on the ground, not out of shame but exhaustion. The stairs weighed more than the laundry baskets and water pails she carried every day. Her ankle had never healed right after the barn fire years ago, the one no one would talk about except in hushed tones and sideways glances. They said it was her fault, they said everything was. She lived in a cottage on the outer edge of town, right before the land curled up into the pine woods where whispers didn't dare follow. The house had once belonged to her mother, a healer, a midwife, a woman who'd been too kind for this place, or too different, maybe both. Mira had inherited the home, the silence and the suspicion. She had no friends, just the wind and the worn quilt that still smelled like lavender and smoke. She lit candles in the windowsill each night, not out of hope but habit, a habit her mother had taught her. Hope had been chased out long ago, replaced by survival. She worked odd jobs, laundering sheets for the inn, carrying firewood for old Mrs. Elkins, even patching torn shirts for the blacksmith's boy. Though he never met her eye, they all accepted her help, just never her presence. She was useful but never wanted. At church she sat in the back pew always. It wasn't by rule but by practice. The pastor never said her name during blessings. Children were told not to speak to her. The one time she tried to offer bread to a neighbor's child, the mother slapped it out of her hand. She don't need nothing from your kind, she hissed. What kind was that? Mira never knew. The quiet kind, the burned kind, the not man enough kind. She had never courted, never smiled at a suitor. When one brave boy did try to hold her hand once during a county fair, his father beat him raw the next morning, saying he'd rather see his son dead than with her. They called her cursed, they called her barren, they called her worse, but they were wrong about one thing: she wasn't barren, just careful. She had hidden the pregnancy well, wore loose aprons, spoke even less, and never stepped into light if she could help it. No one asked questions because no one cared enough to notice until the child came. A girl, small, warm, crying like the world was ending. Mira held her wrapped in the last clean cloth she owned and wept, not because she was afraid but because for the first time in years she felt something other than silence. It was love, swift, terrifying, pure. She named her Lara after her mother. But Dead Hollow didn't take to miracles. When word got out, they didn't knock on her door to offer blankets or help. They came with stones, with spit, with fire in their eyes. Whose is it? Whose sin did you carry? She's a burn it out. They didn't care that she never once asked anything from them, that she'd brought life into the world alone, in pain, in blood, on a floor with splinters and silence. They didn't ask if she was okay, they just assumed, and that was always enough for them. The pastor called a meeting. The women whispered again at fences. The men stayed silent, which was always the worst sound. One morning she woke to find a letter nailed to her door: leave by sundown or be taken. That was all she packed, what little she could: a bottle, the child, a threadbare shawl, and walked her limp, more visible than ever, her body still torn from childbirth. No wagon, no horse, just bruises on her soul, and a daughter in her arms. No one stopped her, not one person. They watched through curtains, through cracks and shutters, through shame that wasn't strong enough to stop cruelty. They watched her walk alone into the pines, into the cold, into the place they said no decent soul dared go. But Mira had never been seen as decent, only disposable, and still she carried on, because that's what women like her do. The broken ones, the blamed ones, the forgotten. We carry even when there's nothing left but ache, even when no one walks beside us, even when we are forced to bleed and keep walking anyway. If this is breaking your heart already, you haven't seen the worst yet. Tap subscribe. I've got another true truth waiting for you tomorrow. The forest swallowed her whole. The trees closed behind Mira like the teeth of a beast, and the snow kept falling soft, steady, silent. Lara whimpered against her chest, a tiny sound Mira could barely answer. Her lips were cracked, her hands raw, her heart empty. Night crept up early in the pines. The last thread of gold light slipped away behind the hills, and Mira knew she would have to stop. She found an old oak, broken at the trunk, gnarled with age, and curled beneath its arms, cradling her child close. She pressed her lips against Lra's forehead, murmuring promises she wasn't sure she could keep. The cold bit hard, sleep tugged at her, and that's when she heard its hooves, slow, steady, coming from the darkness. Her body tensed, fight or flee, but there was nowhere to run and no strength left to fight. All she could do was shield her daughter, tucking Lra deeper into her torn shawl. The figure appeared between the trees, tall, broad-shouldered, cloaked in a hide as black as the night. His horse moved without sound, like some spirit beast woven from the wind. He stopped a few feet away, his face hidden by the shadows in the tilt of his wide-brimmed hat. For a long time neither of them spoke. Mira's heart thundered painfully against her ribs. She forced herself not to cry out, not to plead. If he was here to hurt her, she would face it silent and fierce. She would not let them see her beg. But he dismounted slowly, carefully, as if approaching a wounded animal, not a woman. In the flicker of her small fire, Mira caught his face for the first time. Dark eyes, hair braided with feathers and beads, a mark of red paint streaked across one cheekbone. A Cheyenne warrior, the same kind the townspeople cursed under their breath when cattle went missing or a trail went cold, the same kind they said were nothing but killers and thieves. But this man, he didn't draw a weapon. He knelt instead in the snow level with her, a low murmur in his tongue, gentle, steady, reached her ears. She didn't understand the words, but she understood the sound. It was not a command, not a threat, it was a question, and for the first time in years Mira answered with something other than silence. She nodded carefully. He removed a thick buffalo hide cloak from his shoulders and placed it over her without touching her skin. Then he rose, leading his horse closer, and gestured to the saddle, an offer, not a demand. Mira hesitated, cradling Lra tighter. She didn't know him, she didn't know anything but pain and betrayal. Trust was a language she had long forgotten how to speak, but death was closer than fear. Tonight she struggled to her feet, nearly stumbling. The man stepped forward, instinctively catching her by the elbow. His grip was strong but not cruel. He steadied her like one might steady a tree battered by too many storms. Without a word he lifted her and the baby onto the horse's back, then swung up behind them. Mira stiffened when his arms came around to guide the reins. She had not been held by anyone in so long she had forgotten what it felt like, the simple, terrifying weight of being protected. They rode into the darkness. The town behind her never crossed her mind again. They reached a camp nestled deep in the woods. By dawn, just 3 small lodges, smoke rising gently into the waking sky. A woman emerged, first gay-haired, her face lined but kind. 2 young boys peeked out from behind her skirts. The warrior spoke to them quickly in Cheyenne. The woman nodded and beckoned Mira inside. It was warm in the lodge, blessedly, painfully warm. She sank to the floor near the fire, wrapping the cloak tighter around Lra. Tears welled in her eyes before she could stop them, not from fear, from relief, from disbelief. The warrior squatted by the entrance, watching, not intruding, not speaking. Just their hours passed. The woman fed her broth and bread. She pressed herbs into Mira's hands, and when Mira finally slept, it was the first true sleep she'd had in years, not haunted by whispers or warnings, but held by the simple truth of safety. Days turned into a week. The warrior's name, she learned slowly, was Tasani, meaning he who stands against storms. It suited him. He spoke little English and she spoke no Cheyenne, but sometimes words weren't needed. A nod, a look, the sharing of bread or firewood, small things stitched a bridge between them stronger than any language. When he looked at her, he didn't see the limp, he didn't see the rumors. He saw a woman, bloodied but unbroken, and the tiny life she had sworn to protect. He showed her how to carry fire safely, how to spot rabbit tracks, how to bind a wound with moss, how to laugh again, even if only once, soft and startled. In the quiet they built something unnamed, something more sacred than any vow spoken under a church roof. But beyond the woods the town festered. It didn't take long for whispers to reach the saloon in the chapel. Riders came back from hunting trips with stories of strange fires in the forest, of a woman seen cradling a child beneath a warrior's cloak. The sheriff spat his tobacco into the dust and swore under his breath, "She's whining with the savages now." The pastor fanned the flames harder. "She has defied God's law, she's turned heathen." Danger loomed like a storm on the horizon. Men who had never looked her in the eye before now gathered rifles and torches. Men who never touched her hand in kindness now spoke of claiming her by force, of taking the child and teaching her the right ways. Violence rode hard on the heels of righteousness in Dead Hollow, and Mira, nestled safe for the first time in her life, had no idea it was coming yet. The wind was wrong that morning. Mira woke with a shiver that had nothing to do with the cold. She tightened the hide blanket around herself and Lra, listening somewhere Beyond the tree and the birds had gone silent. Tasani was already up tending to the horses when he caught her eye. He paused, sensing it too. Something was coming. It hit just after midday. A shout, rough, drunken, echoed through the pines. Mira barely had time to grab LRA before the men burst into the clearing. 5 of them, guns, rope, dust caked in their beards and fury in their eyes. There she is, barked the sheriff. The who bursts in. Tasani stepped forward, calm but solid, a wall between them and Mira. The men hesitated just for a breath, unsure of how to handle someone who didn't flinch at the sight of a rifle. But they didn't come for a fair fight. A gunshot cracked the air. Tasani's horse screamed and bolted. The elder woman cried out from one of the lodge's children ran, and Mira ran too, clutching LRA to her chest, heart clawing against her ribs. She didn't look back, not when she heard the men's boots pounding after her, not when a voice called her name like a curse. The snow was deeper beyond the clearing, her skirts tangled in the drifts, her legs too thin and wounded to move fast betrayed her. She fell hard near the creek bed, the world tilting, the baby's cry piercing the frozen air. Rough hands grabbed her, yanked her up. She fought, teeth bared, nails tearing skin, but they ripped LRA from her arms. No. She screamed, the sound torn raw from a place deeper than fear. They laughed, mocked, spat at her. The sheriff waved a hand, teach her a lesson. One of the younger men, a boy she remembered from the church choir once, grabbed a fistful of her hair and slammed her to her knees. Mira tasted blood. They jarred, circling. The boy drew a knife, pressed the cold blade against her scarred cheek. Should have finished you the first time, he sneered. That's when the second shot rang out, not from them, from the trees. The boy's hat flew off his head, torn by the bullet's kiss. He stumbled back, pale with shock. Another shot, this time splitting the sheriff's canteen, water gushing like a wound, a warning. Tasani stepped from the woods like a spirit called by vengeance. He held the rifle steady, aimed low, non-lethal, measured. He wasn't there to kill, he was there to stand, silent, unyielding. The sheriff cursed and backed away, first muttering about, "Not worth the blood." The others followed slowly, bitterly, dragging their wounded pride behind them. Mira knelt, shaking in the snow, the baby wailing nearby, too weak to crawl. Tasani didn't rush to her. He crouched, slowly setting the rifle down. Then he picked up LRA, careful, reverent, and cradled her against his chest. He knelt before Mira and offered her the child with both hands. No words, no rescue, with banners and triumph, just standing with her, waiting. Mira couldn't move at first, couldn't breathe. Then her fingers closed over LRA's blanket, drawing her back into her arms. Tasani remained kneeling. He untied a piece of leather from around his wrist, a small simple braid, and placed it in Mira's palm, a Cheyenne sign of oath, not of ownership, of loyalty. If she accepted it, he would not leave, not today, not tomorrow, not when the world turned its back again. Her throat worked, tears blurred her sight. Slowly she closed her fingers around the braid. A heartbeat passed. Tasani bowed his head, shoulders easing with a breath she didn't even realize he was holding, and for the first time in her shattered, bruised life, Mira realized she wasn't standing alone that night under a cloak of stars so bright they made the mountains glow silver. Mira sat by the fire, LRA asleep in her lap. Tasani sat across from her, mending a strap of leather. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. In the space between them, the crackle of flame, the sigh of wind, something had stitched itself together, not in the way of fairy tales, not fast, not easy, but real, earned. Mira touched the braid at her wrist and whispered a prayer she hadn't dared speak in years. Maybe broken things weren't meant to be thrown away, maybe, just maybe, they were meant to be made into something stronger. They thought she was broken, but someone saw gold in the ashes. Subscribe, I promise you tomorrow's story will prove love still lives out here. The world didn't change overnight. There were still looks when Mira ventured into town, clutching LRA close, shoulders stiff beneath the stairs, still whispers when Tasani traded at the mercantile, quiet, cutting words about savages and fallen women. But Mira was different now. She had learned something in the snow, in the firelight. You couldn't kill a spirit that had already lived through hell. By the first thaw they had a plan they would build outside the towns, gaze deep enough into the valley that the river fed the earth, rich and wild, a small ranch, 3 horses, 1 dream. Mira worked harder than her bones liked, splitting wood, hammering nails, sewing leather until her fingers bled. Tasani taught her how to ride properly, not side saddle like the townsfolk demanded of women, but true and free, knees gripping the horse's ribs, hair streaming like a banner. He taught her how to track rabbits and read the sky for coming storms. She taught him how to patch torn shirts with tiny stubborn stitches, and how to make LRA giggle just by whistling through a blade of grass. Together they built something no one could take with a rope or a bullet, a life, a fire that didn't need permission to burn, but life like the land always demanded payment. The past found them in the form of a rider. One dusty evening, Sheriff Gaines on a pale horse, badge gleaming, a warrant in his hand. Murder, he said, voice slick with false pity, reckless discharge of a firearm aiding a fugitive. The lawman grinned when Mira flinched. He knew exactly exactly where to press the blade. He's not a citizen in the eyes of the court. Missy makes it real easy. Tasani didn't flinch, didn't move, but Mira burned. She stepped between them. LRA on her hip. You'll have to kill me first, she said, voice steady as river rock. The sheriff laughed a cruel shrill sound and reached for the child. Mira didn't think. She moved. The butt of her father's old hunting rifle connected with the sheriff's jaw. A sickening crack. He crumpled in the dirt, blood blooming across his mouth like a poisoned flower. Tasani scooped up the warrant, tore it clean through and dropped the pieces at the man's feet. We leave, he said simply, for good. The next few hours were a blur of movement, packing essentials, loading saddlebags, whispering promises to the land they had almost called home. LRA slept against Mira's chest, tiny and warm and trusting. Tasani rode beside them, one hand on his rifle, the other on his horse's reins, his eyes always on the horizon. No more looking back, no more begging to belong. They belonged to each other now. By moonrise they reached the river. Crossing the water ran fast and cold, a dangerous place to ford, especially carrying a child. Mira hesitated, heart hammering, the old fear wrapped around her like icy fingers. What if you can't do it? What if you drown her? What if you fail? She turned to Tasani. He simply held out his hand, not to carry her, not to save her, to stand with her. She gritted her teeth, hitched LRA higher and nudged her horse into the river. The current fought her, her skirt soaked, heavy, dragging like chains, but she leaned forward, whispered to the mayor, "We're stronger than this," and the horse found her footing and Mira found hers. Step by step they crossed together. When they reached the far bank, Tasani let out a breathless laugh. Rare, beautiful. Mira found herself laughing too, wet, shaking, wild. They were alive, and no badge, no Bible, no whispered curse could take that away. Weeks later, nestled deep in the northern hills where the rivers braided silver through the grass, they found a place the world hadn't ruined yet, an abandoned cabin, a well, room for 3 hearts to grow. Mira planted seeds with her bare hands, teaching LRA how to press the earth down gentle and firm. Tasani built a corral, taught Mira how to break a cult without breaking its spirit. At night they sat under the stars. Sometimes they spoke, sometimes they just listened. The fire between them wasn't fast and furious, it was slow, steady, unstoppable, the kind of fire that melts chains, but nothing is without scars. One evening while fixing the fence line, Tasani found her Mira sitting in the dirt, staring at the leather braid still tied around her wrist. Silent tears ran down her cheeks. Sometimes she whispered, voice broken, "I still feel them judging me." Tasani crouched before her. He didn't tell her not to feel it, didn't say it would all go away. Instead he pressed his forehead to hers, closing his eyes. "You are not what they called you," he murmured. "You are what you choose to be." Mira's fingers tightened in the braid. Not a prisoner, not a ghost, a mother, a fighter, a woman who had survived both hate and hope and chosen hope. The final test came on a windswept morning in the spring. A rider appeared, not with guns or warrants but with a letter. Her father had died, left behind debts and demands. The town council offered mercy if she abandoned Tasani and returned. They would clear her name, give LRA a proper life. Tasani said nothing when she told him, only nodded, pain flashing in his dark eyes like distant lightning. He wouldn't ask her to stay, it had to be her choice. Mira sat by the river that night. LRA played nearby, tossing pebbles into the water, laughing. Mira clutched the letter in her hand, crumpling it slowly until it dissolved into pulp. She turned toward the cabin, smoke rising from the chimney, a beacon in the dusk, her home, her family, her future. She rose and walked back to them, steps sure and strong. "You've come this far with her, you felt that, didn't you? Subscribe. I want you to meet someone else tomorrow, someone just as forgotten." The town didn't deserve a goodbye, but Mira needed one, not for them, for herself. So one misty morning Mira saddled her mare, tied LRA's little shoes tight, and rode back into the place that had once buried her alive. With whispers, Tasani rode beside her, silent and steady. At town square was just waking when they arrived. Merchants opening shutters, women sweeping dust from their doorways, Sheriff Gaines, jaw still crooked from the last meeting, cowling from the porch of the jailhouse. Every head turned, every voice hushed. Mira dismounted, slowly lifting LRA down with hands that didn't shake anymore. She walked right up to the council steps where the preacher, the mayor, and the men with their cold eyes sat, sipping coffee and pretending to own the world. She unpinned the letter from her dress, held it high enough for all to see, and dropped it into the dust. "I don't want your forgiveness," she said, voice clear as a bell. "I'm not coming back." A ripple ran through the crowd, shocked disbelief, even a few gasps. Sheriff Gaines rose halfway from his chair. "You got no place outside our mercy, girl." Tasani stepped forward, then just a half step, but his presence cracked through the tension like thunder. Mira didn't need him to say a word, she had already made her choice. She looked at the crowd, at the faces that had once defined her worth, and then she turned her back on them all. She mounted up LRA snug in her arms and rode away, not in fear, not in shame, but in triumph. DC dust curled behind them like smoke from a burned bridge. They didn't stop riding until the town was just a memory swallowed by the horizon. That night they made camp by the river where the cottonwoods grew thick. The stars came out shyly at first, then Spilled across the sky like scattered embers. Mira braided Lra's hair by the firelight. Tasani carved a small wooden horse, smoothing it carefully with his thumb. They didn't talk about the town. There was nothing left to say. Instead, as the fire burned low, Tasani reached into his satchel and pulled out a thin, simple strip of leather. Woven through it was a single white bead, the color of snow melt. And second chances. Without asking, he knelt before her, not like a man begging, like a man honoring. He tied the band around her wrist, right over the old scars where ropes had once bruised her skin. Mira's throat tightened. There were no vows spoken, no grand declarations, just this, a hand clasped tightly in hers, a fire warm against the dark, a daughter safe and laughing in the grass, a life hard won, imperfect and theirs. Seasons changed, their home grew stronger with each passing year. Mira taught Lra how to bake bread over open coals, how to ride bareback at a gallop, how to hear the truth in the wind. Tasani taught her how to track elk, how to tell stories with just his hands, how to forgive without forgetting. They named their second child Mara after Mira's mother, the one who had once dared to tell a little girl she was worth more than shame. No churches blessed them, no town crier announced their life, but when Mira looked up at the stars scattered across the velvet sky, she knew they had been witnessed. They had been chosen on the coldest nights when the snow drifted high against the cabin walls. Mira would press her hand against the window pane, fingers tracing the frost. Tasani would slip his hand into hers, anchoring her there, pulling her back from old ghosts, and together they would stand in the silence, in the dark, in the endless wide unknown, holding on, holding strong. She was never a curse, she was someone's miracle all along. Subscribe and let me introduce you to the next miracle tomorrow.